Okay, so the last unit that we covered, or the last PowerPoint that we covered in this unit, dealt with social psychology, but it specifically dealt with attribution, whether it's internal or external, whether it's stable or unstable, and also conformity, compliance, and obedience within the realm of social psychology, as well as discrimination, prejudice, racism, all of that. So now we're going to move into group behavior, specifically altruism and attraction. So we're going to cover parts of social psychology that explain why certain people get married or why certain people attract other kinds of people, specifically to social psychology. So topics covered: what makes you attracted to others? What are the cultural standards for physical attractiveness and the different types of love? So first up, for attraction, you should remember the primacy effect. Now, we've covered the primacy effect before in learning, where you're more likely to remember the beginning of a list rather than the middle of a list. Okay, that's in response to learning styles. But if you're looking at social psychology, then it's talking about the first impression that you get when you meet somebody. So yes, first impressions do matter. Okay, it is very difficult to shake a negative first impression of somebody. Does that make sense so far? It's pretty common sense, right? When it comes to laws of attraction or factors in attraction, we're going to talk about 5 different terms that you should be familiar with. The first one is the mere exposure effect. Now, we've discussed this previously. Another term for this is the proximity effect. Robert Zajonc, hope that's how you pronounce it, he came up with the theory that the more you're around somebody, that familiarity breeds attraction. Okay, so the more you're exposed to something, the more fondly you feel about that something. Okay, so like for instance, people may look at Benedict Cumberbatch and you think, no, not cute. But then eventually, if you keep seeing him in movies or on the Sherlock Holmes episodes, eventually that familiarity and that repetition will be comfortable for you, and that could lead to attraction. Okay, how many of you have ever had a crush on somebody who, or you don't have to answer this literally, who is in most of your classes? Okay, you're more likely, since you're more exposed to that person, to develop an attraction to them just simply by the process of being around them. So that's what the mere exposure effect is, or the proximity effect. That's part of the reason why long-term relationships, or sorry, long distance, not long-term, those do work. Long distance relationships have this stereotype of not being successful because you lack that mere exposure effect. You lack the proximity of it. Are we good on this? And another theory under the factors of attraction is reciprocal liking. What does reciprocal mean? If you reciprocate something, what does that mean? To return something. So you are more likely to like somebody who likes you. Okay, so if they like you, then you're more likely to like them. Why do we have this factor of reciprocity? Because it boosts our self-esteem. It's nice to be wanted. We don't like uncertainty. We like stability. So if we know somebody likes us, then we're more likely to like them back because there's a certain level of certainty in it. It's kind of like if someone says, I've seen this on Twitter before, it's like, what if we kissed? Ha ha ha, just joking, unless. Okay, so you want to feel out those vibes and see if they're equivalent to yours. Okay, similarity is also a factor, which goes against like the common saying that opposites attract. That's actually not psychologically accurate. In reality, the more similar a person is to you, the more likely you are to be attracted to them. Okay, birds of the feather do flock together. That's because similarity breeds contentment because it's a type of stability. It's a type of familiarity. And also, if you're with somebody who validates your beliefs, that can also validate your self-esteem. Okay, so people with the same views on marriage or the same views on political affiliation or the same views on religion are more likely to be content because of that similarity, as opposed to if you have a number of differences that would result in conflict or confrontation. Okay, so this is one thing that people, yeah, kind of like two peas in a pod. This is one thing that people often get mistaken when it comes to attraction, where they think, oh, opposites attract. Well, actually, it's more likely that similarity attracts. Any questions? All right, liking through association. You can have classical conditioning. Is classical conditioning voluntary or involuntary? It's involuntary, okay? Operant conditioning is voluntary. Okay, so with this, let's say that you love football. You intrinsically enjoy watching football. Well, one of the anchors, one of the presenters, I don't know what they're called, for those football games is on every time you watch your particular team. So you start associating that anchor with your football team, which means you get good feelings whenever you see them. You have conditioned yourself to associate the anchor with your favorite team. Now, are you consciously doing that? No. Okay, you are unconsciously doing it. It is involuntary. Does that make sense? It's kind of like, I think there was someone on TikTok that was trying to classically condition their boyfriend, where they're like, oh, every time I see him, I give him a chicken nugget or something. So now he associates me with chicken nuggets and he loves chicken nuggets. So that means he must love me. It's like, that, yes, I saw that. Yeah. Yeah, yeah, which is insane. But yeah, for those of you who couldn't hear, because that was the one I was thinking of. I knew that there was one that was crazy, and I was like, what was it? All right, so this woman on his like crazy confessions on TikTok, she was like, yeah, every time my boyfriend goes to sleep, I put a nicotine patch on him, and then before he wakes off, I take it off. So he starts craving nicotine and thinking that he's craving me because he's only satisfied when I'm around when he's sleeping. And it's like, okay, that's hella manipulative. So don't do that. Please don't get your significant other addicted to a substance in order to make them fall in love with you. Although I guess in fairy tales, there are love potions. So maybe that's how it relates. Okay, so yes, liking through association with something works. Are we good on this?
Say like when they break up, they like have all this like withdrawal.
Yeah, he's just gonna be like shaking, like vibrating, be like, I need her back. Oh, that's insane. I would be so mad. Or if like he like, because I know like for teachers, we can't have nicotine. If we do, then we have to pay an extra $50 a month for our insurance. So like, what if he gets tested or something for nicotine for insurance purposes, and they're just like, yeah, you have lots of nicotine in your blood system. And he's like, how is this happening? Plus, I think you could poison someone with nicotine if you overdo it. There's just so many variables that are problematic to the situation. People are getting way too comfortable on that platform. Yeah, it's like, how are you snitching on yourself? Like back in my day, like we wouldn't post when we did potential crimes, but nowadays it's like live stream, like and subscribe. All right, the pairing game. In general, as social creatures, humans tend to reach towards finding partners. Okay, so when we interact with others, we try to determine whether their intelligence, their interests, their attractiveness compares to ourselves. So we tend to seek out partners with similar attractiveness levels as us. Although sometimes, have you ever seen a couple where you're just like, man, he must be like funny or something, because she's like super cute and he's just kind of eh. So you're like, there must be something else making up for the, unless you're, I guess if you're not, what's the word, shallow. Okay, so we have this pairing game where we try to find somebody who's similar to us. So going back to that idea of similarity, birds of a feather, we want to make sure that if we're a 6, we're with a 6 or higher. If we're a 7, then we want a 7 or higher. Just kind of makes sense. Although, I don't know, I think Beyonce, that's just not fair. Like if a scale from 1 to 10, like she'd have to be above a 10. And like Jay-Z's okay, but Michael B. Jordan. Yeah. Yeah. All right. When it comes to biology, how do we even get on that topic? It's like, when it comes to biology, we also, like animals, have pheromones playing a role. Okay, so how do pheromones work? Well, remember the parts of the brain. You have the hypothalamus that controls our endocrine system, our hormones. We have an olfactory tract and olfactory nerves. Remember that the pheromones go on the air and they go into our nose, hit our olfactory bulb, and that's going to send a message to our hypothalamus saying, hey, what's up? How you spell your number, girl? All right, so our bodies naturally secrete these fluids through glands in our body. That just sounds so gross. Our glands that contain natural pheromones. Okay, so think like your underarms. Okay, that would express those pheromones. Then your nose, that's what vomeronasal organ, nose, detects the pheromones and then sends a signal to the olfactory nerves. Those olfactory nerves send that message to the hypothalamus, and that triggers emotions. That can trigger emotions of attraction, sexual desire, arousal, any of those things. Now with animals, that's pretty evident. Okay, like yesterday, man, okay, I was driving home. I'm in my neighborhood and I pull in, and like before I even get to my house, I see my roommate's dog. He's just hanging out in someone's yard. That's the third time he's escaped this week. And so I go up and I thank the neighbor. I'm like, hey, you know, what has it been bothering you? He's like, yeah, no, he's trying to get to my girl dog because she's in heat. He's trying to dig under the fence. And I'm like, well, our dog's fixed. I don't know what he's trying to do here because whatever. But that is how it works with animals. And to some extent, we have that with humans as well. One thing about smell with your partners is if you're attracted to a partner based on their natural pheromones, then that means that y'all are genetically diverse, meaning genetically different from the other. Because if you have too much similarity in genetics, obviously, evolutionarily, that is not going to benefit your species. Okay, so if you have somebody that you smell and you're just like, no, not attractive, then that means y'all are too much alike in your genetic code. So evolutionarily, your body is telling you, hey, don't have children with them because they're too similar. You want somebody who will diversify your genetic code for the continuation of the species, because that will make you more, what's the word? It'll make you less susceptible to disease and other factors within the environment. Species-wide, not individual-wide. Okay, so this, oh yeah, it says right here, this helps partners seek out people with opposing immune systems so that you can have genetic diversity within their spawn, and then also partners with compatible DNA. Are we good so far? All right, when it comes to attractiveness, physical attractiveness does play a role in the frequency of dating. People who are more attractive tend to date more, and this is in both men and in women. With this, however, we have a cognitive bias that emerges known as the halo effect, not the video game, or the physical attractiveness stereotype. Y'all have taken AP Lit and AP Lang, right? Or you're in it now? Some of you are like, what's that? All right, so if you've ever read a book or a story where the bad guy, the villain, has something physically wrong with him, like he's described as ugly, or maybe he has a messed up back or a broken arm. I think, was it King Richard in one of Shakespeare's plays? That's a common theme in literature, is that they try to indicate who is the villain in the story by showing them as somehow deformed or unattractive. Okay, so like if you're thinking The Lion King, Scar has a scar on him, okay, and he's skinny and lanky. Okay, that's supposed to indicate that he is the villain. So because of that, that ties into an actual psychological theory, the theory that we view attractive people as healthier, happier, more honest, and more successful. Now, is that accurate? No. Okay, but pretty people do have a amount of privilege to an extent because of this halo effect. Because they're pretty, people assume they're smarter than they are, or they're more successful than they are, or they're more honest than they actually are. People tend to be nicer to them because of that. Okay, so that is a cognitive bias. Are we good so far? Now, when it comes to physical attractiveness, that's going to vary by culture and among people. Okay, different cultures are going to have different standards or beauty standards that they try to live up to. Okay, so for instance, in Mauritania, in the country of Mauritania, not pronouncing that right, obesity is revered, meaning it is respected, it is desirable. So young girls are sometimes force-fed to obtain a weight that the government has described as life-threatening. Okay, whereas in America, we have the opposite end of the spectrum, where you'll have body shaming of people or fat phobia against people who are perceived as overweight. And we have a lot of our social media pointing towards losing weight or different methods to lose weight. Okay, so you can have different beauty standards depending on the culture and the time period. If any of y'all have looked at Renaissance paintings, okay, well, the guys, they're pretty buff, but the women, okay, are they stick thin? No, they've got like dimples on their butts and like thicker thighs, and you're just like, oh wait, I was born in the wrong time period, right? Okay, so it changes based on the standards within that society and the time period. And remember that ethnocentrism is the viewing of other cultures through the lens of our own culture. So viewing other cultures as different or barbaric or as strange without recognizing the similarities that we share with those same cultures. How many of y'all remember the Nasarema activity that we did at the beginning of the year? Let me type that in the chat to see if y'all can remember. Nasarema. Okay, the Nasarema Society. Spelled backwards, it's American. Okay, it talked about the magical box of medicines, right? The medicine cabinet, the amulets, the ablution room, which was actually just the bathroom. Okay, the dentists and the doctors, like these terrible hospitals that people went to die, and they paid a lot of money to get in, and then they paid a lot of money to get out. Okay, viewed through that ethnocentric lens, okay, we're going to view it as strange instead of familiar. Okay, so here we have Chinese foot binding dating back to the Tang and the Song dynasty. Well, we also as a culture have restricted women's movement with their feet, with the emphasis on high heels. With body modification that we see in Africa, we see the same thing today with tattoos and even internal piercings and scarification as a form of body modification. Okay, gauges as a form of body modification. Okay, so these modifications aren't anything new. You're going to see them across different cultures and across different societies. Does that make sense? I can't remember if this is the guy with the most piercings in the world. There was somebody in the Guinness World Records book. I think it was a woman. It was just like, you couldn't even see her skin because it was just piercings all over. Although my favorite is the guy who grew his nails out, like to be the longest in the world. Have y'all seen that? Where they like curl? Yeah, I think there's, I don't know if y'all remember this, Johnny Knoxville. He makes movies. I can't say the name of it but it's based like the donkey. I think one of his pranks that he did was, or that he was dared to do, was he had to drink something that had been poured from the nails, and he ended up like throwing up because it was that bad. It's like the things that stick with you. All right, so now that we finished talking about attraction, let's talk about love. There are different types of love that have different levels of intimacy and commitment and passion. Okay, fatuous love is the love that is associated mostly with passion. So sexual or romantic feelings, an aroused state of intense positive absorption in another. So this is the honeymoon phase early on in a relationship where y'all are constantly talking to each other or texting, and you're coming up with cute nicknames, and you don't see any red flags because you have on rose-colored glasses, right? You also have companionate love. This is a deep affection for another person but it doesn't necessarily have to involve sexual or romantic feelings. It can be intimate because you have feelings of closeness and attachment to that person. It can be a form of commitment, like say it's a roommate. Okay, well, if you're rooming with somebody, like say your first college roommate, y'all may have feelings of closeness and attachment, especially if you went to high school together and you're going to the same college together. You may have commitment because you've promised to live in that apartment for 12 months because you've signed a lease. That doesn't necessarily mean that you have passion within that relationship. Okay, it's a platonic kind of love. Also, consummate love. Consummate love is the most complete and ideal form of love because it combines all three of these factors. It has intimacy, passion, and commitment. So that's like the true love, the fairy tale love. Does that make sense so far? Okay, so with making love last, oh wait, I forgot this slide. Here is Steinberg's triangular theory of those three types of love and how they interact. So if you look at the categories, intimacy is just liking. Passion is romantic or sexual affection, and commitment is a promise to stay with that person. So if we look at just liking, this is intimacy alone. So your friend, somebody that you drive to school with, somebody that you sit at lunch with, that's liking. Companionate love is intimacy plus commitment. So this could be your roommate. Maybe you and your best friend get an apartment up in Auburn and you sign a 12-month lease. You're committed to completing the lease and you like each other. Empty love, this is commitment alone. So let's say that a couple's been married for 20 years and the only reason they're not getting divorced is because of the kids, you know, like staying together for the kids. Like, let's get them through high school before we split up because we don't want to have all this like emotional turmoil for them during this point of their life. That would be empty love, just the commitment. Fatuous love is passion plus commitment. So the early stages of a relationship when y'all are official and you upload on Facebook, hey, it's not complicated anymore. Infatuation is passion alone. So you don't have a commitment. So they're just beneficial friends. Romantic love is intimacy plus passion. Okay, so also in a type of relationship there. Consummate love falls in the middle and it hits all three of those categories. We good so far? All right. Then how do you make a relationship last? Well, number one, you need to have equity. Equity is another term for basically equality. Okay, so with equity, this is a condition where you give in a relationship and you also receive in a relationship. You may give different things, but you receive in a same proportion. Okay, so it's not in terms of equality as in everyone receives the exact same thing. Equity is receiving what you need in equal amount. Okay, so like let's say a person in the relationship is the cook. They enjoy cooking, they enjoy making dinner, they enjoy grocery shopping. The other person doesn't. Okay, so how do they contribute to the relationship if they're not the ones doing the cooking? Well, what could they do instead that could help out? They could take out the trash after the cooking's done. They could do the dishes after the cooking is done. That is equity. They're not doing the exact same thing. It's not that they're alternating, okay, on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, you cook, and then on Saturday, Sunday, blah, 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 I'll cook. But they are both contributing in equal amounts or proportions to the relationship. Okay, so one person may handle finances, the other person may handle childcare. Okay, one person may work at a job, another person may be a stay-at-home parent. Okay, something along those lines. Good, Dahi, doing the dishes. Okay, so equity in love is important if you want to make sure that the relationship doesn't become codependent and to make sure that it doesn't breed resentment. Because imagine that you're constantly the one giving in the relationship. You're buying all the food, you're buying all the gifts, you're making all the dinners, you're cleaning all the kitchens and bathrooms and taking out the trash, well, eventually you're going to start getting salty. And you're going to think, why am I putting all of this into this relationship if I'm not getting anything out of it? And another factor that can assist in making love last is self-disclosure. Okay, this helps to breed intimacy. So if you are sharing information about yourself, that's not necessarily public information, okay, that mutual exchange can help breed liking between a group, okay, because they are disclosing to you or you are disclosing information to them. Does that make sense so far? All right. So we finished the discussion on love. Now we're going to move on to group behavior. And yes, we are going to talk about group projects. Okay, so the topics we're going to cover are social facilitation and social inhibition. What this means is if you're in a group, what behaviors are going to get better versus what behaviors are going to get worse. Okay, the theory with that is the Yerkes-Dodson theory, the theory of arousal. Difficult tasks are going to be completed more effectively the fewer people there are around you. Easy tasks are easy to complete even if there are a lot of people around you. So we're going to go into detail about that. Social loafing. This is the belief that you don't have to contribute as much to the group because there's no way of measuring whether or not you contribute to the group. And then de-individuation is the loss of your identity to the group. Okay, so y'all come up with one thing that people excel in doing when they're in front of people, or one thing that you do better at when in front of people versus one thing people do worse on when in front of people. So first, let's look at something that people can do really well in front of others. Anything?
Oh, you want an example?
Yeah. Sports. Okay, so if you play on a team, you've got to know how to play in front of people. If you're a cheerleader, you've got to know how to engage the crowd. Okay, you're supposed to be able to do flips and cheers and all of that in front of a group. Now, if you're a sports athlete, if you're an athlete or a cheerleader, right, you do practice. You're constantly practicing and doing drills and working on your cheers so they become second nature. If they become automatic, then it doesn't matter if you're in front of a group or not. You're still going to make that free throw. You're still going to do the cheer correctly, right? So that's an activity or a behavior that you can do in front of other people because you've done it so many times. What about an activity that people don't do as well on in front of people? All right, someone said debate, speaking. Okay, I do that too. I'll be talking and then all of a sudden my tongue and mouth don't work right. And so I'll just stumble over words and I'm like, why? Why is this happening? Like, it's just ridiculous. So speaking in front of people, staying on task in front of people, those could be behaviors that you would prefer to be alone rather than having to do in front of somebody else. For instance, if you're going to do a presentation, would you prefer to do it in front of the whole class or simply record it at home and then play it in front of the whole class? Most people are going to want to record it so that they don't make any mistakes in front of other people. Okay. There's a difference in this because of the idea of social inhibition and social facilitation. Again, this is a theory that's espoused by Robert Zajon. Okay, so social facilitation is the tendency for us to do better in a behavior when we're in front of others. Okay, so the presence of others increases arousal. Now remember, that just means interest. That just means the excitement level, not necessarily anything sexual. Okay, so the presence of others increases your arousal. We know that there's an optimal arousal theory. For difficult tasks, do you want high arousal or low arousal? Low arousal, because if your arousal gets too high, then you can't focus. But for Easy tasks, you're going to want high arousal, okay, so that you can get through it. Like if you're running, okay, if you're running a mile, you may want to have earphones in, okay? If you're writing an essay, are you going to want music blaring like Eye of the Tiger? Probably not. Okay, so that's what the different levels with the optimal arousal theory. So easy tasks are enhanced with more people around you. Difficult tasks are inhibited when there's more people in front of you. Okay, so tasks that are more likely to be socially facilitated are simple, well-learned responses: running a mile, playing basketball, cheering for a team. Whereas difficult tasks like writing an essay or giving a presentation, you don't want to have to do that in front of a lot of people because you get more nervous and you can't concentrate. Are we good so far? Does anybody need this slide? Okay. For social inhibition, this is where we do worse because we're around other people. So these are complex or little practiced responses. Okay, so in my second period class, I may stumble over definitions more often because I haven't practiced the lecture yet. I'm going through my notes and remembering it from the last time I gave the lecture a year ago, or over a year ago, technically. Okay, but by the time I get to seventh period, do I pretty much have everything down pat? Yeah, because I've practiced it enough times. So it depends on how much you've done the behavior before and whether it's easy or complex. Now, social loafing, y'all are probably all very, very familiar with, because I'm sure that in some point in your educational career, you have had to do a group project. Okay, now the issue with group projects is that everybody in the group is supposed to get the same grade. And there are some people who know that and they take advantage of it. They may say, hey, I want so-and-so on my group because I know they'll do the entire project. Okay, I was one of those people that would do the entire project. So people constantly wanted to be on projects with me because they knew that they'd get an A. The reason that this occurs is because of social loafing. This is the idea that people in a group will extend less effort because they know that their effort can't be measured. How do teachers try to get around this with group projects? You'll do member evaluations, okay? Giving feedback from your other group members saying, oh, so-and-so did the whole project or so-and-so didn't do their part and that's why we were up until 2 a.m. completing the assignment, okay? So they try to get around that idea of social loafing by providing a way to quantify how much effort a person has put into the project. But the fallback on that is sometimes with those feedback forms, people are too nice to say, hey, this person didn't do jack. And so they'll just put, okay, give them the full points, whatever, just move on. It's part of the reason I don't do group projects. Also, if like there's plagiarism on the group project, it's like, well, who plagiarized it? Like I have to give everybody a 0 because I can't tell who cheated on this one particular part on this project. So I'm just like, do it individually. No more group projects. That makes sense so far? Okay, de-individuation is the loss of identity because you are participating in a group. So you have less personal responsibility. This is where we get the mob mentality and mob rule and the pack mentality. Okay, because you're seen as a monolith. The entire group is acting rather than individuals within the group. So you see a loosening of normal constraints on behavior and an increase in impulsive and deviant acts. Because while you're in a group, you feel like you're blending in and therefore you don't feel as accountable for your actions. So that's where you get mob mentality. Okay, more recently, you could probably associate this with the insurrection on the Capitol. Okay, you see a lot of people at the Capitol, a few people pass the barricades and start moving into the Capitol. What does everyone else do? They follow them in. Okay, the idea of mob mentality. If someone else is doing it, then it must be okay. Same thing like if your parents have ever told you, well, if all your friends jumped off a bridge, would you do it too? Well, I mean, with de-individuation and levels of conformity, there's a chance. That's how cults emerge, because of de-individuation and our need for conformity and stability. Does anybody need this slide? Does anyone know what football team that is? This like real football, soccer? I don't even know. Someone else made this PowerPoint. All right, going back to Zimbardo's prison study. What happened in that prison study? Somebody summarize it for me. Was it an actual prison? Exactly right. That's the Lucifer effect. You have college students that are randomly assigned the position of guard or position of prisoner. And what happened was they started fulfilling those stereotypical roles of what is a prisoner supposed to do and what is a guard supposed to do. So normal non-sadistic individuals eventually became tormentors. They were punishing the prisoners and they were abusing the prisoners because they fulfilled what they considered the role of the prison system. Okay, now with this role in de-individuation and role playing, how do you think the study would have been different if instead of emulating a prison with guards and prisoners, the study had emulated a hospital with nurses and patients? Would the students who are the nurses act the same way as the guards? No, why not? Yeah, you have to have bedside manner. Okay, you have to be compassionate if you're going to be a nurse or a doctor dealing with sick people. Okay, so the roles would be different. There's a stereotypical role of what nurses do versus what patients do. And there's a stereotypical role of guards versus prisoners. Okay, so the idea of roles can play an important part in behavior. Okay, so like if you are playing the role of a student versus playing the role of a teacher, playing the role of a child versus the role of a parent, we have certain schemas for what those roles are supposed to entail and what our boundaries within those roles entail. We're talking about group polarization, groupthink, and altruism. Those are all very different things. Group polarization is where members of a group get more extreme or fanatical. Groupthink is where you don't perceive outside perceptions of things and everyone pretty much just agrees on everything, so you don't get different perspectives. And then altruism is pro-social behavior, okay, behavior that we do that benefits others. So we're going to go into detail about each of these. Group polarization is where we tend to flock together with people that we agree with. Okay, so this is kind of like where we get those echo chambers that we see on the internet. You're more likely to follow people who already believe what you believe. And so as a result, you're only getting one perspective or objective of a view. And so that's going to radicalize you and move you further and further away from the moderate medium opinion on something and more towards the extreme form of something. Okay, so people get more and more extreme as they act in isolation. This can be the example of, say, terrorist cells. The internet has played a very large role in group polarization because, again, you get those think chambers, those bubbles in your social media where you're not open to outside views. And so you only get reinforcement from things that you already believe. And eventually there are going to be more and more extreme views as you move further into radicalization. Now, this is known as risky shift. Risky shift is the tendency to shift from uncertainty about a task to making a decision with a greater risk after or following group discussion. So you're discussing something with a group, and then that can lead to riskier behavior. Okay, so like kind of like if you're hanging out with friends outside and someone says, I bet you can't jump over that rock. And then y'all start discussing it and you start thinking, okay, what if I get my motorcycle and I ride it over the rock? Like it just gets more and more extreme with more group discussion because you don't have as many limits. So that's leading into radicalization. Okay, and the reason it's called polarization is because you can be on opposite ends of the spectrum. Okay, you could be radical as, like, let's say radical liberals or radical conservatives. Okay, but they're not going to fall into that middle group where most of the population tends to fall, about 68% of the population. The radical groups tend to fall into less than 2% of the population. Okay, with groupthink, this is what leads to group polarization. Groupthink leads to bad decisions because everyone assumes that the group supports the decision, because people don't want to speak up if they think that the majority of the people are going along with the plan. This goes back to our conformity studies with the ash line experiments. Remember that there was one person at the end who knew what the right answer was, but because the other Confederates said this line or that line or the other line, they went along with what the group told them to do, even though they weren't pressured to do what the rest of the group had done. So groupthink is when you have group cohesiveness, the fact that the group gets along, and that's more important than considering the facts. Now, the problem with that is that the group will learn to support bad decisions. Okay, people are less likely to argue against a group decision, and they don't want to stand out and be ostracized from the group. Okay, so an example of this would be Pearl Harbor. Y'all may be familiar with the fact that Japan was in World War II fighting with the Nazis against the Allied forces, including Britain and France. But the United States had not yet gotten involved because they said, hey, we're neutral, we're staying out of this. That was until Japan made a direct attack on American territory, on Pearl Harbor. Now, what led up to that decision to bomb Pearl Harbor? Because very clearly, it did not work out well for the Axis. What it did do was tick off the Americans and get them involved in the war. First with defeating Japan, and then, first defeating Germany and then defeating Japan. Okay, so how did this come to be? Well, in these groupthink conditions, you typically see the following. You see a respected leader. Okay, so an example of that would be the Emperor of Japan with the Meiji Restoration. So because they followed their emperor and he was highly revered, he could have been, or he or his military generals would have been the ones making the decisions. And not many people want to go up against a military general or an emperor. High cohesion within the group. Okay, that we're looking at a collectivistic society rather than an individualistic society. Isolation of the group. Japan was famous for its period of isolation prior to 1863. High stress. Well, you're in the middle of the war. World War II is probably a high stress situation, so that could play a role. A stereotyped view of the opponents. During World War I and World War II, there was quite a bit of propaganda on both sides, okay, viewing or dehumanizing the enemy. The illusion of invulnerability, the belief that Japan could not lose because they had already defeated China so thoroughly with the rape of Nanking. Unquestioned morality of the group, the belief that they were superior to the other Asian nations and superior to the Allied powers. Pressure to conform is another condition, and illusion of unanimity, all right, or the belief that everyone else is on the same page and you're the only one who dissents. Okay, so if you meet those conditions, then you have a tendency for groupthink to be what leads to bad decisions being made, because people don't want to speak up if they think that they're the only ones who are going to be speaking up against a decision. Does that make sense so far? All right, altruism. You've probably heard this word before in your Membean series. Altruism is selfless, okay, as opposed to selfish. Okay, so shellfish. So altruism is the belief in being concerned for others, or the practice in being concerned for others without any goal for reward. So this is a pro-social behavior. It helps us with our social interactions. Helping others makes us more likable. Okay, however, there are some conditions in which we're less likely to help out others. Y'all have probably heard of the bystander effect. The bystander effect is the theory that if you're in a large group of people, you're less likely to help out somebody who's in distress. So a decreased likelihood that an individual will help a person in distress due to the presence of others. Now, why would that be true? Why would the presence of other people make us less likely to help somebody? How many of you have ever done CPR training? Okay, so when you're doing CPR training, they do like, okay, staying alive, the whole song thing. But they tell you that you need to tell somebody to call 911. How do they tell you to do that? Oh, that's cool. Exactly right. You tell someone directly. You don't just yell out, somebody, anybody, call 911. You point at them and you say, hey, you call 911. You give them an instruction specific to them. Then they're more likely to carry it out because the responsibility has been put on them rather than just diffused to the whole group. Okay, so the bystander effect works this way because if we're around a lot of people and we see somebody asking for help, we're more likely to ignore that person because we assume that somebody will do it. Somebody else will take care of it. That it's not our personal responsibility. Whereas if it were just us and this other person needing help, then we would feel like, okay, I'm the only one who can help, so I better go ahead and start helping. This is called the diffusion of responsibility. Okay, the presence of others makes us feel like, oh, hey, we don't have to do anything. This is kind of like with the group projects that we talked about, where if you have a group, you can't measure individual effort. So there's always going to be that one person who's like, yeah, I'm not going to do any work. I'm going to rely on my group members to get me an A. Okay, so for the most part, the majority of the population falls under the bystander effect. But there are some people who fall under bystander intervention. This is where they have a tendency to help people despite the presence of others. So the bystander effect doesn't apply to them. Now I have put some bystander effect videos into the lecture series for y'all. Also this weekend, I updated, I think it was 3 videos from our social psych unit for if you want to review those videos, and then I'll keep working on this one as we finish up the unit. So new videos have dropped on the school lecture page, as well as some videos illustrating the bystander effect. So the optimum number of witnesses is you, just one person, okay, being able to help, because otherwise we make excuses of, oh, we don't need to help because someone else will do it. Now, this is an example that's used, I'm pretty sure, in every class that ever discusses social psychology, but I do want to give a trigger warning for this. There is physical and sexual violence in this case study that we're about to look at. Okay, if any of those things is triggering to you, then you have my permission to not participate in this activity and instead read about it in your textbook. But if you want to stay and participate in this activity, I just wanted to give you a heads up before we get started. So what we're going to do is we're going to read the case study of Kitty Genovese. This event in history is going to lead to the development of the 911 system for calling emergency services for help. And it's also going to be a key case study in studying the bystander effect. And why is it that the presence of others diffuses social responsibility? Now, in the process of going through this story, we're going to do FRQs or TAD for each of these terms: social inhibition, dehumanization, frustration, aggression, fundamental attribution error, the just world phenomenon, the bystander effect, and informational social influence. Okay, social inhibition is when the presence of others makes us less capable at a task or less competent at a task. To dehumanize someone means obviously to treat them as less than human or not to see them as a person. Frustration, aggression deals with an external frustration that leads to an aggressive behavior. Fundamental attribution error is a type of stereotyping where you stereotype a group as a certain way, whether it's based on gender, race, or what have you. The just world phenomenon is the idea of karma, or things happen the way they happen for a reason. Good things happen to good people, bad things happen to bad people. Bystander effect, we just covered. People are less likely to intervene in the presence of others. And informational social influence is when you get information from the environment that affects your behavior. Okay, so the Kitty Genovese case. March 13th, 1964, along a serene tree-lined street in the Kew Gardens section of Queens, New York City, Catherine Genovese began the last walk of her life in the early morning hours. She had just left work, and it was 3:15 a.m. when she parked her red Fiat in the Long Island Railroad parking lot 20 feet from her apartment door. As she locked her car door, she took notice of a figure in the darkness walking quickly toward her. She became immediately concerned as soon as the stranger began to follow her. As she got out of the car, she saw me and ran, the man told the court later. I ran after her and I had a knife in my hand. She must have thought that since the entrance of her building was so close, she could reach safety within seconds. But the man was faster than she thought. The man caught up to Catherine, who was all of 5'1" and weighed just 105 pounds, near a street light at the end of the parking lot. I could run much faster than she could, and I jumped on her back and stabbed her several times, the man later told the cops. Oh my God, he stabbed me, she screamed. Please help me, please help me. Some apartment lights went on in nearby buildings. Irene Frost heard Catherine's screams plainly. There was another shriek, she later testified in court, and she was lying down crying out. Up on the 7th floor of the same building, Robert Moser slid open his window and observed the struggle below. Hey, leave that girl alone, he yelled into the street. The attacker heard Moser and immediately walked away. There was quiet once again in the dark. The only sound was the sobbing of the victim struggling to her feet. The lights in the apartment went out again. Catherine, bleeding badly from several stab wounds, managed to reach the side of her building and held onto the concrete wall. She staggered over to a locked door and tried to stay conscious. Within 5 minutes, the assailant returned. He stabbed her again. I'm dying, she cried to no one. But several people in her building heard her screams. Lights went on once again and some windows opened. Tenants tried to see what was happening from the safety of their apartments. The attacker then ran to a white Chevy Corvair at the edge of the railroad parking lot and seemed to drive away. On the 6th floor, Marjorie and Samuel Koshkin witnessed the attack from their window. I saw a man hurry to a car under my window, he said later. He left and came back 5 minutes later and was looking around the area. Mr. Koshkin wanted to call the police, but Mrs. Koshkin thought otherwise. I didn't let him, she later said to the press. I told him there must have been 30 calls already. Miss Andre Peak, who lived on the 2nd floor, heard the commotion from her window. I heard a scream for help 3 times, she later told the court. I saw a girl lying down on the pavement with a man bending over her, beating her. About 3:25 a.m., Catherine, bleeding badly, stumbled to the rear of her apartment building and attempted to enter through a back entrance. The door was locked. She slid along the wall until she reached a hallway leading to the 2nd floor of 8262 Austin Street, but she fell to the vestibule floor. In the meantime, the man had returned again. I came back because I knew I'd not finished what I set out to do, he told cops later. He walked along the first row of doors and calmly searched for the woman. He checked the first door and didn't find her. He followed the trail of blood to the doorway where Catherine lay bleeding on the tiled floor. And there, while the defenseless victim lay semi-conscious, incoherent from pain and loss of blood, he cut off her bra and underwear and sexually assaulted her. He then took $49 in cash from her wallet. Why would I throw money away? He asked the court at his trial. As Catherine moaned at his feet, probably unable to comprehend what had happened to her, the man viciously stabbed her again and killed her. The man, who had selected his victim purely at random, ran to his car, still parked where he left it. The entire event lasted at least 32 minutes.
He said later that murder was an idea that came into my mind, just as an idea might come into your mind, but I couldn't put mine aside. Catherine was his third murder. At about 3:50 a.m., a neighbor, Carl Ross, who lived on the second floor of Catherine's building in Austin Street, finally called the police. But before he did, he called a friend in nearby Nassau County and asked his opinion about what he should do. After the police were notified, a squad car arrived within 3 minutes and quickly found Catherine's body in the hallway on the first floor. She had been stabbed 17 times. Her torn and cut clothes were scattered about, and her open wallet lay on the floor next to her. Her driver's license identified her as Catherine Genovese. Detectives from the 112 responded and began an exhaustive investigation. A canvass of the neighborhood turned up several witnesses, including the one who had notified the police. When cops finished polling the immediate neighborhood, they discovered at least 38 people who had heard or observed some part of the fatal assault on Kitty Genovese. So looking back at these terms, how would social inhibition be applied to the case of Kitty Genovese? As a reminder, social inhibition deals with the Yerkes-Dodson arousal theory, that more complex and difficult tasks are harder to do around people, but easy tasks are easy to do around people. There's not as much pressure. Social inhibition, which is when you do not feel pressured to do or say something, can be applied to the case because many people did not feel compelled to call the police. Okay, so how difficult is it to call the police? Is it easy or hard? Well, nowadays it's pretty easy, right? So if all you got to do is take out your cell phone and hit 3 numbers and call the police, okay, under the social inhibition theory, you don't really have a lot of inhibition because it's something that's easy to do around others. Okay, so this case led to the implementation of the 911 system to make it easier for people to do that simple phone call to call for help. Because how long did it take the police to get to the apartment building after the call was made? 3 minutes. And the attack took over 30 minutes. Okay, so social inhibition, even if there are a lot of people, it's not really hard to call 911. How would dehumanization apply? Bystanders do not see Kitty as a person in need of help, but rather dehumanized her and was seen as just something that was unimportant or someone else will help. Dehumanization is when someone is not treated humanely can be applied because Genovese called out for help and no one came to her aid. Okay, both of those are good examples. Okay, over 38 people could hear or see what was happening to her and yet did nothing. Okay, because maybe they didn't know her. You know, you live in an apartment complex, you don't really get to know your neighbors, as opposed to if it were a suburb and you heard your neighbor yelling out. Okay, so she was dehumanized in that respect. She was also dehumanized by her attacker, okay, who was viewing her as just a random murder, that he had gone out to kill her and he was going to finish what he had come out to do. So you see dehumanization on the part of the perpetrator and dehumanization on the parts of the witnesses. Frustration, aggression, that deals with hostile behavior, where you have an external frustration that then drives you to a behavioral aggression. Now, did the attacker illustrate any sort of frustration, or did he just randomly pick Kitty? He randomly picked her. He said, a thought just popped into my mind. That was his third murder. So he didn't really even see them as people, but he had something external that led to this drive, like drive reduction theory, that led to these behaviors, acting out this fierce aggression against this stranger. Fundamental attribution error. That is when we apply a stereotype or apply an idea that is erroneous, that is not correct. Okay, so the fundamental attribution error here is that people are naturally altruistic. The idea was that somebody will call. Y'all may remember the wife who told her husband, oh, don't call, they've probably already gotten 30 calls already, when in fact the police department hadn't received any calls about the attack on Kitty. Okay, so the fundamental attribution error there is that somebody will help. It doesn't have to be me. Just world phenomenon. What is that? Similar to karma, the idea that good things happen to good people and that bad things happen to bad people. Okay, so some people may have been able to justify not helping Kitty because they may have reverted to victim blaming. Okay, what was this young woman doing out at 3 in the morning? Well, she was working. Okay, or the old victim blaming of what were you wearing, what were you drinking, that sort of thing. Okay, do you know who's responsible for or what's the cause of rape? Rapists. Not what you're wearing, not what you're drinking, not what you say or do, because it's about power. And so that's the just world phenomenon. People are probably thinking, oh, whoever's out there screaming or being attacked is probably deserving of what's happening to them. Victim blaming. Bystander effect, obviously, that is a big part of what happened here because it's what helped coin the term bystander effect, that if you have a lot of people or witnesses, that the diffusion of responsibility ultimately leads in people not doing what they're supposed to do because they believe that somebody will do it and it's not on them. And then informational social influence, that's non-coercive information that you get to help and help make decisions on what's going on. So in this example, you could have that guy who called the police who first called his friend to see what he should do. Okay, so he called his friend and then got feedback on what he should do, and then he called the police. That's non-coercive information about the situation that led to a certain behavior. Okay, so now we're moving on to the section on aggression. Now, the definition of aggression is hostile behavior with the intention of harming someone. Now that harm can be physical or it can be mental. Okay, so physical abuse, emotional abuse, any of those things fall under aggression. Hostile aggression is based on anger. That's the type of aggression. And it occurs when someone is upset and they are responding emotionally with the intent to harm. So that's type 1 of aggression. Type 2 of aggression is instrumental. The motivation to harm another is not based on emotion, but instead it's a means to an end. Okay, so being aggressive towards somebody because you can get something out of it versus being aggressive towards somebody because you're genuinely emotionally distressed. Okay, so we're going to cover nature versus nurture as it relates to aggression. Are you born with it or is your environment playing a role? The frustration aggression principle, like we discussed earlier, and conflict, specifically as it relates to social traps, mirror image, and GRIT. So in terms of explanations of aggression, we have covered this before, particularly with the behavioral approach to psychology. Y'all may remember Albert Bandura and his Bobo the Clown experiments, where he utilized observational learning to see how kids responded to watching adults behave violently towards a Bobo the Clown doll. Okay, so this is the idea of modeling behavior. It's more so based on nurture, so social learning of how we're supposed to behave. So how would media play a role in that? Well, you have people always arguing that violence in video games somehow correlates to violence in real life, or that what you see in music videos or what you see on TV can influence how you behave. Okay, but aggression could be reinforced directly or indirectly, meaning directly or vicariously. But when it comes to the influence of media, we don't really have a strong argument for causation. Okay, you just have a very weak argument for correlation. But I think more so modeling by role models would play more of a role in the social learning of aggression. Okay, now when I say that it can be reinforced directly or vicariously, that relates to observational learning. Okay, so for instance, if you are playing on the playground and you're aggressive and you get to keep whatever toys you want because no one else wants to mess with this angry little toddler who doesn't want to share toys. Well, that's directly reinforcing your behavior. Being aggressive gets you more toys, less people mess with you. Versus if your parents are aggressive towards each other, you could vicariously learn through social learning that that's how people are supposed to interact in relationships. Okay, not they're necessarily being aggressive towards you or you're being aggressive towards them, but you're learning through observation. Okay, so we see more of an argument towards nurture relating to aggression as opposed to nature, although obviously puberty, hormones, that does play a role in your levels of aggression as teenagers. Are we good so far? So moving away from the behavioral approach, let's look more at the biomedical approach. So nature as it relates to aggression. You could have genetic predispositions. For instance, some dogs are bred to be more aggressive and some are bred to be more compliant. Even among cats, for instance, ragdoll cats are bred to be like ragdolls. They just kind of fall apart in your arms and just lay limply. Okay, they're going to play nice. There's a terrible stereotype against pit bulls being naturally aggressive. So, I mean, I don't really know how to feel about this genetic thing because I feel like how you raise them is how they're going to turn out, whether it comes with dogs or kids. But there is some sign of a genetic basis for aggression. Neural influences, like if you get more stimulation to your amygdala or more stimulation to your prefrontal cortex. Remember that prefrontal cortex is responsible for personality and decision making, and your amygdala deals with fear and aggression. So yes, that does tie to aggression. Biological chemical influences, testosterone, which is an androgen. Okay, it's a hormone that's produced in your endocrine system, especially as you go through puberty. High testosterone can increase aggressive behavior. So testosterone boosts aggressive behavior, and then aggressive behavior also increases the amount of testosterone. So this could be why there's a gender difference when it comes to aggression, where men are typically considered to be more aggressive than women. It could be a biological response to hormones. And then, of course, drugs and alcohol can play a role in decreasing the ability for you to make proper decisions, because alcohol and drugs often act as depressants that interfere with the functioning of your frontal lobe. So we know that alcohol is involved in about 40% of violent crimes, and it's involved in about 75% of spousal abuse. Okay, like we talked about before with addiction, men tend to have a higher rate of alcoholism than women. Okay, and then we see that paired with high testosterone, so increased aggression, decreased inhibition in your frontal lobe, then we see that frustration aggression model, not just an external emotional event, but actually leading towards the behavior in question. Are we good so far? All right, so causes of aggression. We're typically going to cover John Dollard's theory, but eventually that theory is going to be expanded upon by Leonard Berkowitz. Okay, so first, John Dollard said that in animals, aggression is preceded by frustration. Okay, a frustration is an emotional response. You have a goal-directed behavior, like I want the treat or I want the water bowl, and then that is frustrated. That means your behavior towards that goal is prevented. So you're prevented from getting the treat, or you're prevented from getting to the water bowl. That's going to lead to aggression. So if you try to give a treat to a dog and you're like, no, 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 and you take it away each time, eventually they're going to get aggressive and snatch it out of your hands, okay, because you've been preventing that goal-directed behavior. So frustration creates anger, anger creates aggression. Aversive stimuli like pain, for instance, can also increase aggression. So like we talked about earlier in the year with correlation, there was a false correlation between ice cream sales and murder rates. Well, that was a confounding factor of it happened during the summer. It wasn't that ice cream was increasing the murder rate. It was instead that the heat was increasing both the amount of ice cream that was being purchased and the aggression as people became frustrated with the heat levels. So here we see the correlation is more likely between the temperature or the heat present during a certain time, thus leading to frustration. And then that aggression is going to be generated from the frustration. So there's more spousal abuse in hotter years and months as opposed to colder years and months. So we can tie a correlation there. Now, whereas John Dollard studied animals as it related to frustrations and aggression, in humans, we're more going to focus on Leonard Berkowitz. So he believed that frustration leads to anger, which is an emotion, which can then lead to aggression, which is a behavior. So emotion equals behavior sometimes. The cause of the frustration, however, must be intentional and triggering. Okay, so if we know it wasn't an intentional frustration, then we're less likely to respond with aggression. Okay, let's say that somebody bumps into you in the hallway. Well, typically, the people you go to school with, right, or my coworkers, right, are not going to purposely bump into you. Okay, so if they turn and they say, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry, are you likely to start throwing punches? No, because the frustration wasn't intentional. It wasn't triggering. Okay, but what if your arch nemesis is walking down the hallway and they look you directly in the eyes as they step on your Nikes? Okay, that's intentional. That's going to be triggering. Okay, so in humans, there is cognition behind it. You have the emotion, the cognition leading to the behavior. In animals, it's simply you prevent them from the goal, and that's going to result in aggression. Does that make sense so far? So sometimes aggression is going to lead into conflict. Now, this doesn't necessarily have to be physical conflict. Confrontation of any sort could be classified as conflict, but this comes from incompatibility of action, goals, or ideas. This can be something as large as national disputes or wars, versus just interpersonal disputes between like a couple or a friend group. Okay, so this relates to the social dilemma in which you're in a situation that places the desires of one person into conflict with the good of the group. This is mixed motive interactions. So like an example of this is when an individual will behave in a way that benefits them in the short term, but it will hurt the group in the long term. Okay, so benefits one person in the short term, but it hurts the group in the long term. Now, this social dilemma eventually becomes known as a social trap, with one example being the tragedy of the commons. Okay, so the social trap is a situation in which a group work to benefit themselves individually, but end up hurting the group as a whole. So like, let's say I said, I can give you 6 extra credit points now on your next test or on your project, or if you wait until May 20th, I'll give you 12 extra credit points. Well, the group might decide I'm going to do the 6 instead of the 12 because I don't want to wait that long. I want to go ahead and get my grades in. Okay, so that could be an idea of a social trap. The tragedy of the commons is, y'all may remember the commons in the Industrial Revolution. Britain had some land that was common to everybody, where you could grow food or you could let your cows eat on the pasture. But eventually, that common ground started getting sold during the Industrial Revolution. Okay, so that's what we're talking about when we talk about the tragedy of the commons. We're talking about the common ground where anyone could bring their cows. Okay, so the idea behind this is that you have shared resources. The commons don't belong to any one person. They belong to the whole neighborhood. But those shared resources can be depleted if individuals act in their own self-interest. So let's say that there's enough commons for every person in the neighborhood to put 2 of their cows in the commons. Okay, now if I decide I'm going to put in 3 cows, then someone's probably not going to notice. They're just like, what's one more cow? But what if I decide to put in 3 cows and Micaiah decides to put in 3 cows and Kevin decides to put in 3 cows? Then eventually, are we going to run out of grass and food on the commons? Yeah. So that's the social trap. When individuals take advantage of a situation with the diffusion of responsibility, oh, it's not a big deal. I'm just adding 1 more extra cow. Well, you're depleting the shared resources. That eventually is going to hurt everybody in the neighborhood, but you are trying to benefit yourself in the short run. Okay, conflict can also create the mirror image effect. This is when one side views the other side as diabolical or evil. Okay, so distorted images between conflicted parties are eerily similar. So like an example of this would be political parties, right? So we see the other group as evil and untrustworthy. They in turn see us as evil and untrustworthy. Okay, like you'll have some people saying like, oh, the radical liberals are doing this, that, the other. And then other people are saying, oh, like they're all Nazis, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so that same propaganda, that same view of we're in conflict with each other. They're the opposite of everything we are. We are good, they are bad, end of discussion. Now that's a type of radicalization. That's not going to lead to positives for the entire group. Instead, it leads to more conflict. So how do you resolve that conflict? Well, one way is through GRIT, graduated and reciprocated initiatives in tension reduction. One side announces that they want to work together, let's reduce tensions. And then you start with conciliatory acts. So saying, hey, let's come to the table and discuss maybe sort of how we can get along. And then you do little small things like, hey, I'll free a political prisoner from this country if you'll free your political prisoner from your country, and we'll do a prisoner swap. Not a huge deal, just something to get the ball rolling. This is going to increase trust and cooperation. It allows for less isolation or more sharing of culture. But basically, it's the foot in the door metaphor for countries. You've already done this. You've already let go of this one prisoner. or you've already compromised on this part of the treaty, so you're going to do more. Okay, so a little bit leads to more. So with grit, to resolve conflict, you need to regulate selfish behavior. So maintaining social pacts, telling the individual who's putting too many cows on the commons, hey, cut it out, there are consequences. If you keep doing this, then you will face those consequences. Communication amongst the group and appeals to altruistic norms, the appeal to our common humanity. Now, unfortunately, this is the least effective mood. People are much more likely to be moved by, hey, if you keep being a jerk, we're going to kick you out, rather than, hey, you should just be a good person because being a good person is what we do. Okay, because people want to get something out of that relationship. Okay, so last we were meeting, we talked about conflict and how to resolve conflict. Now we're going to move into some other principles in social psychology, the social exchange theory, the idea of social scripts or schema that we follow, the reciprocity norm, which is just fun to say, reciprocity, and the social responsibility norm. So first up, we have the social exchange theory. This is how we define our relationship with another person. Okay, this is defined based on what we put in to the relationship versus what we get out of the relationship. Are we putting in more or are we getting more from the relationship? The cost benefits analysis. What kind of relationship we think we deserve, and the chances of having a better relationship with somebody else. Okay, the grass is greener on the other side. Like you have a boyfriend or a girlfriend, but you're just like, hey, how do they spell their number over there? Okay, so we try to base our relationships off of what we get out of the relationship and what we put in, our own perception of ourselves, our perception of the other person, and, you know, the Russian roulette of, can we do better, or is this the best that I'm going to do? Also in the social exchange theory, in interacting with others, we often try to decrease their discomfort or their embarrassment as a type of reciprocity, because this helps release endorphins. Like if anyone in your friend group has ever said something like super dumb or embarrassing, and you just like don't say anything about it, y'all just move on because you're like, okay, I don't want to embarrass them because that wouldn't feel good for me. So I'm going to give into this relationship. It's part of the reason why watching The Office can be so difficult sometimes, because Michael Scott does some just absolute clown shoes stuff that you feel like secondhand embarrassment. That secondhand embarrassment is real, where you're like, I'm not even the one who did the stupid thing, and yet I still feel as like embarrassed, like as if I did the stupid thing. So we try to preserve other people from feeling that level of embarrassment as a part of this cost benefits analysis in our social exchange. Within this, we also follow, yeah, you feel cringy, exactly, like ultimate cringe. We also follow certain social scripts. These are steps that we follow in social situations. For instance, when you go to a restaurant, okay, you go to the front where there's a greeter and then they seat you. Do you go up to the front and immediately order something? No, you go and sit down. Then when the waiter or waitress comes up to you, they ask you what you want to drink. Then they go away. Then they come back and ask you what you want to eat. Then they go away. And then they may ask for dessert. They may hand a check to somebody. Typically in a patriarchal society, they're going to hand the check to the man as opposed to the woman, or they're going to hand the check to the older person as opposed to the younger person. So these are scripts that we follow in day-to-day life that we may not even be aware of. However, we can change those scripts. So having new mental instructions for how to deal with an experience after we've gone through it. Okay, so like in this example with child psychology, trying to teach a child how to cope with their anger and not take it out on others. Okay, so you can learn from past experiences from like, oh, I did it wrong that way. In the future, I'm going to stop and do this instead. So you can revamp your social scripts. But for the most part, these are very, very strong instructions for how we're supposed to act in society. And they're often just, you know, unconsciously moved into our psyche rather than something that we actually study. The reciprocity norm is just a fancy way to say the golden rule. Treat others the way you want to be treated. That's it. Okay, this is the expectation that if we act nice to people, then they in turn will act nice to us. So people will respond favorably to each other by returning benefits for benefits. So you scratch my back, I scratch yours. If you're a turd to me, then I will in turn be a turd to you. And we will see who can be the bigger turd. Okay. This also ties into social responsibility norm, where it's not just about reciprocity. It's not just about what can I get out of this by being nice to somebody, but it's the idea that you have an obligation to help others. So those who are able to take care of themselves have a duty or an obligation to assist those who cannot. And this is something that's noticeable in the human species. Like we have remains from ancient human ancestors that lived to an older age, even though they had a broken leg, or they couldn't hunt, or they couldn't gather. So even prior to the Neolithic Revolution, we see that within the human species, we saw a value in taking care of people who couldn't necessarily contribute to the survival of the group. So that idea of social responsibility, not just the cost benefit analysis of social exchange theory, but moving beyond that and including some altruism. Okay. And that's it, y'all.